KPIs, what they are is a study of what drives a business. So in essence, in every business, what we need to do is increase revenue and decrease costs, which will lead to increased profitability. Now, in order for us to understand KPIs, it's best to go through an example of a real business and understand what drives its profit, and so we can design the proper KPIs. We're going to cover a couple of different business models and get down to what really matters most in driving the business forward. What we'll do is examine the drivers of a real business, understand how to design KPIs, dive into the insight and the action plan from the KPIs, and we will learn how to tell KPIs like a story. And I'm going to take you step by step through this process. Now, let's look at the business that we are analyzing today. And the business is Gut Buddy Yogurt. And as you can tell, this is a business that manufactures yogurt. So what they do is they manufacture peach yogurt, strawberry, and banana flavors. And what they do is they sell it through a distribution network to a variety of stores and supermarkets. Now, the objective of the business is obviously to sell as much as possible. So they want to maximize their sales and reduce their costs so that they can increase profitability. Obviously, they have to sell as much as possible in each store chain and improve the cost of goods and have enough cash on hand to see it all through. Now, let's look at the income statement of Gut Buddy Yogurt and try to understand how much they sell, how much is their cost, and what kind of profit are they looking at. So when we look at the income statement, we can see that the revenue is $20.2 million. Their cost of goods is $15.4 million, which leaves them with a gross profit of $4.8 million. Their operating expenses is 4.5, and that leaves them with an EBITDA of $300,000 or $0.3 million. And EBITDA is basically earning before interest, tax, depreciation, and amortization. EBITDA is basically income from operations. So basically it ignores any non-cash items or non-operating items such as depreciation, amortization, or interest or tax. Obviously, by looking at their income statement, we can tell that the objective of the company is to try to increase that revenue number and reduce that cost of goods sold number, and also work on reducing the operating expenses so that they can maximize their profitability. Now, keeping that in mind, let's look at what drives the business. So let's pull up the income statement again for visual aid. If we're trying to design KPIs for Gut Buddy Yogurt, we are most likely going to look at revenue. Now, one of the most frequently used revenue KPI is examining the growth year over year. So this is one of the KPIs that we will look at today. The other one is same-store sales year over year. The reason why same-store sales matter is because we are ignoring the effect of expansion to other stores. What we basically want to look at is the same store and understanding the effect of promotion and spreading our message on increasing sales in the same store. And so that's why this will be our second revenue KPI. Now, we'll also look at some cost KPIs, and I think the most relevant is going to be gross margin. And gross margin by far is the most looked at KPI by investors and bankers and any relevant third parties. The reason is gross margin gives you a glimpse right off the bat whether the business is able to extract as much profit as possible from its sales before spending anything else on OPEX. So you got your revenue number here on top, you have cost of goods, and the gross margin is going to sit right here by saying divide 4.8 million by the 20.2 million to arrive at what the gross margin is. We'll also look at gross margin per SKU, and SKU refers to stock keeping unit, and what that is just every product that the company sells has a SKU number. So any of the flavors that they're making at the Gut Buddy Yogurt company will have a SKU number that identifies the product. And so we'll look at the specific gross margin for the SKU. as a way to tell the profitability on a more detailed level. Now, let's look at revenue KPI number 1, and that's revenue growth year over year. Now, when we're measuring the revenue growth year over year, let's say we are in 2020 and we are in the month of May. So in May 2020, if we want to measure revenue growth year over year, then what we'll do is we'll look at the year-to-date sales as of May 2020. In this case, we'll assume that our sales year-to-date on May 2020 is $7 million. What we'll need to do next is look at 2019, and for us to be able to compare apples to apples, we need to have also the month of May 2019 and the year-to-date sales on the end of May 2019, which were $6 million in this case. So now for us to get the revenue growth year over year, all we have to do is take then the 7 million from 2020 minus the 6 million from 2019 divided by then the denominator or the base is what it was last year. So then this is simple. 7 minus 6 is 1 million divided by 6 million. That gives us 17% revenue growth year over year. Let's recap this real quick. Growth revenue year over year is going to be looking at May in 1 year. It doesn't have to be May. It could be May, could be June or July. And looking at the number, the amount of sales year to date as of the end of May. And you have to compare it to the same period last year. And that's, in this case, is $6 million. And then just take the 7 minus the 6 divided by the 6, which is the base year last year. And that will give you the 17% year over year growth. Now, the nice thing about having this measured is that now that we know that the year-over-year growth is 17% in May, if we're measuring this every month, then we're able to then chart this on a graph and say, visually, here's how the business is doing. In January of this year, our year-over-year growth was 15%, and then it grew to 20%. And it was growing nicely into the year 30 and then 40% by April. And then we're taking a slight pullback here in May down to 17%. So this will give a nice visual aid to management so that they can immediately see that there is a slight sign of trouble here as we navigate the year. Now, the insight that we gain from such KPI is that if the company is targeting an 80% growth year over year, let's say that the company's ambition is to hit a year over year growth of 80%. If we are seeing a 17% year over year growth as of May, this may be a cause for alarm and will force us to look deeper into the business and find out the areas of trouble. Now, let's look at the KPI of revenue growth year over year, but we'll look at it from a same-store standpoint. The reason why we go through a same-store analysis here is that we want to strip out the effect of expansion. So we don't care if we went to a bunch of new stores this year. What we want to measure is, in Whole Foods in this example, are we selling more or less year over year? And the reason why it matters is because it gives you an idea. Are you then spreading your message to the consumers in that same store? Are you promoting enough? Are you getting people to buy your product in that same store? And so when we want to measure it, we will look at it in the same way that we did for sales growth year over year. We'll say, okay, just in Whole Foods in 2020, but in the month of May, year-to-date sales were $2 million. We'll compare it to the same period in 2019, and we have to look at it in the same exact period of time. So then we're looking at it and it's 3 million. And this, it is no surprise here. It looks like we are taking a pullback here in Whole Foods. Last year we sold $3 million as of May 31st. This year we are selling $2 million only as of May 31st. This is a sign of trouble, and if we do the math here, we'll find that revenue growth year over year in the same store was, as you can imagine, negative. So we're looking at a negative 33% then pull back in the growth year over year. Now, obviously, the insight that we get from such KPI is that if we have a decline in the same store year over year, it triggers a further study into what's happening in the business, and it will force us to ask questions such as, are we creating enough awareness around a product in the same store? If we're seeing a decline in sales, this may be a sign that we are not doing enough in creating the right awareness and spreading the message. The second thing we need to ask ourselves in this case is that, are we doing enough promotions and discounts? Now, when you're walking through the aisles of a supermarket today, what you'll find is that there is a bunch of discounts and coupons that you can find in various flyers and publications. You can get these coupons and go get a discounted product. This is the trick that these manufacturers do in order to get you to buy the product. Once you taste it, you like it, you'll come back and buy more of it. And so we need to ask ourselves that question, whether we're doing enough promoting the product. Then the third thing we need to ask ourselves is whether we're doing enough sampling in the store. So if you go to a Costco or a BJ's here in the United States, you'll find that there is an employee standing, and he's usually a third-party employee hired by a marketing firm. And what they're doing is they are sampling the product. They're giving away a taste of what the product is so that you can taste it, you like it, you go and buy it. And so we may not be doing enough in that regard as well. And so, as you can see, measuring the revenue growth year over year in the same store is crucial in understanding what are the trouble areas in the business. Now, let's examine the cost KPIs, and the first one we want to cover is gross margin. Now, gross margin, as I've said before, is the gold standard in KPIs when it comes to manufactured goods. The reason why investors and bankers and third parties really focus on gross margin is that it gives them a glimpse right off the bat whether the business is able to extract profit from the sale. So if you sell one jar of yogurt for $1, how much profit are you able to extract from that? Are you getting 25 cents profit? Maybe better 30 cents? Are you getting 50 cents? The more you can increase the gross margin, the more profitable in general you'll be. And so what we need to look at here is, again, we look at an income statement view and look at also May 2020 year to date and examine our revenue, $7 million. Our cost of goods sold is $5.3 million, leading to a gross profit of 1.7. And that tells us that gross margin is 24%. And obviously 24% is coming from dividing 1.7 by 7 million. So dividing the gross profit by the revenue number, and that gives us gross margin of 24%. This obviously speaks to the efficiency of the manufacturing process, and so the more you're able to optimize your cost of goods sold, the more your gross margin will go up. Now, let's look at the insight that we get from gross margin. If we expect gross margin of 28% and we already have 24% and we are in May, we have to consider a few things. The first thing we need to look at is that, are we wasting material? A big part of cost of goods and a big place where businesses fail is that they have wasted material. And waste can come in the form of wasted raw material, wasted packaging, and in many cases I've seen in the past where companies will come up with a new marketing campaign that has new packaging, and after we print it and it costs so much money, we realize that the message changed and we go in with different packaging, and so we have a bunch of packaging material that's going to be thrown away. That sometimes could be into the hundreds of thousands of dollars wasted, and that would immediately go toward cost of goods, leading to a worsened gross margin. So we need to look at material, whether we're wasting. The second thing we need to consider is, are we spending too much on freight in? Obviously the cost to bring in raw material and packaging, this cost to bring it in for manufacturing is a cost of goods, and so that counts toward the cost of the inventory itself. And obviously the inventory becomes then your asset. Once you sell it, it becomes cost of goods. And so the cost to bring in the raw material and packaging is important here. The third thing we need to consider is whether we're facing rising costs. And the costs here could be the overhead, which is the utilities and the rent of the plant, or could be the labor costs. And so like if your hourly cost of the employee is going higher, obviously this will increase your cost of goods. And so these are the things we need to consider when we are looking at the gross margin that's declining compared to our expectations. Let's go over the cost KPI of looking at gross margin per SKU. So previously we've seen gross margin as a whole for an entire lineup of products. And now we'll look at it for one SKU. And the reason you want to do this on a SKU level is because you want to be able to determine the holes in your gross margin. And so if your gross margin in general isn't performing, when you look at it on a SKU level, and SKU again stands for stock keeping unit. SKU is just like the way that we look at products. Every product has a SKU number, and that's the way we identify the product. And so when we look at the gross margin per SKU, then we're able to tell which SKU isn't performing, and then we can then diagnose that by diving deeper into it and understanding our costs. And so when we look at banana yogurt, and I'll look at banana yogurt because that's my favorite flavor, I'm going to look at the income statement and see that revenue as for the month of May is $2.5 million. The cost of goods sold is $2 million. Gross profit is $500,000. And we're looking at gross margin of 20%. And you can immediately see here that since this is a 20% gross margin and the overall for the company is 24%, this is one of the products that is probably pulling back the entire gross margin for the company because it has a lower gross margin percentage. And so we immediately have to look into the cost to produce this SKU and see whether it's meeting our expectations. So obviously the insight when you're looking at banana flavor cost, when it's too high, you got to examine similar things to gross margin ratio. You got to examine, are we wasting material? Are we buying raw material that we're not using? You got to look at the freight in. Are we spending too much money bringing in the raw material and the packaging to the factory? You got to also look at rising costs, maybe labor, utilities, whatever the case is. Now, when we look at banana yogurt, we need to understand what goes into producing one jar of yogurt. So the cost of goods sold here will consist of raw materials, in this case, banana and milk. The second thing that goes into making the banana yogurt is the labor cost with this little guy here that makes the yogurt at the factory. And I'm not sure why he's wearing a safety hat, but he has one. And the third thing that goes into making the yogurt is going to be the overhead. And that's the actual cost of the plant itself. That's what runs the plant. So this obviously includes the rent of the plant and the utilities and any other costs associated with running the plant. The fourth cost that goes into making the yogurt is going to be the freight in. Obviously, you got to bring in your raw materials in order for you to work on it. And so all the packaging, all the milk, all the bananas, all that comes in with a cost. And so the other thing to remember too is that bananas, usually manufacturers that make any product that includes a fruit or a vegetable, they don't really go out and buy a bunch of bananas from suppliers. They don't buy fresh bananas. What they do is they buy like a frozen banana puree. And so they bring in thousands of pounds of frozen banana purees, store them in a frozen section of the factory in some sort of a freezer and keep them until they need them. Usually they have about 2 or 3 years of expected life. They don't last forever. So in many cases, this raw material could be wasted if you don't estimate how much exactly you need of this raw material. You could end up wasting some of it. And so these are the components that go into making a jar of banana yogurt. Now, let's shift gears and go into the balance sheet KPIs. And the reason why we go into that is because we want to be able to preserve our cash. And so the way to do that is to reduce the collection cycle and at the same time, increase the cash out cycle. So it's real simple. You need to be able to bring in cash sooner from your customers and spend it out slower to your suppliers. And so this is how you enhance your cash position. And so in looking at the balance sheet KPIs, the first KPI we'll cover is Days Sales Outstanding, or DSO. And what Days Sales Outstanding is just the number of days that it takes you as a company to convert your sales into cash. So it's the duration of time it takes from creating an invoice, you have a sale, until you actually have the cash in hand. And so we'll look at DSO, or Days Sales Outstanding. We'll also look at DPO. DPO, or Days Payable Outstanding, is almost the flip side of the coin. And so if DSO is saying how long it takes us from a sale to cash, and so what Days Payable Outstanding is going to be is the amount of time it takes from incurring a cost or being invoiced by the supplier until the point in time that we actually lay out the cash. And so naturally, as you may imagine, you would want to increase the number of days to pay the supplier, and you want to reduce the amount of time to collect from customers. And so this is the dynamic that we will be looking at. We want to widen the gap between the DSO and DPO. An example is that if your DSO is 45 days, you would want to have something like 70 days to pay your suppliers. So you may have a cushion there between the collection and the payment. Now, let's go into DSO, or Days Sales Outstanding. Definition, obviously, as we said, is the number of days it takes to convert sales to cash. Let's go an actual example of DSO. And in this case, we'll say that the formula is accounts receivable divided by credit sales. In this case, we only look at credit sales. We're not really concerned with cash sales. We're measuring the number of days it takes to bring in cash from credit sales. And so we are dividing only by credit sales in this case, and then multiply that by the number of days in the period. And so for the period of May 2020, if our accounts receivable is $2 million, and our credit sales is $1 million, obviously 31 days in May, when you divide 2 divided by 1 equals 2 multiplied by 31, that gives you 62 days. And so we are saying here that it takes 62 days to collect or to bring in the cash from the sales that we've made. And so what insight do we get from that? When we look at the industry average, when it comes to manufacturing, the average is about 45 days. And so if we're saying that it takes us an average of 62 days to convert invoices into cash, this is a sign of trouble. And so when we see that, we want to look at, do we have slow paying customers? And so one of the biggest problems with collecting cash is if you have slow paying customers, typically your biggest customers, which is the biggest supermarket chains, are going to be slower payer customers because of the size and because they command that sort of tolerance in the market. They're able to pay you a lot slower, so they know you won't complain, they know that you want the business, and they'll keep paying you slower. And so you need to push back and try to get a little faster if you want to improve your DSO. At the same time, you want to be looking at the payment terms you're creating. So when you're negotiating with a new customer, now you have a chance at negotiating from scratch. You can actually then say you want to get paid in 30 days. Obviously, they'll push back and they'll say, no, 60. And so you try to maybe meet in the middle, maybe a 40 first, and see if you can get 40 days. If you can't, then 45, but try to stay away from anything over 45. Now, the third thing to look at is whether we're making it easy for customers to pay. There are many cases where I look at invoices and I don't see payment instructions. And so you want to be able to make it super easy for customers to pay you fast. And so the first thing to look at is, Do you have your contact information listed on every invoice? Do you have your banking information? Do you have your address correct? Do you have every possible way for this customer to pay you? If you accept any other means of payment, list it on there. Make sure that the customer can pay you fast. Okay, let's move on with our balance sheet KPIs. And now let's look at Days Payables Outstanding. And as we said before, Days Payable Outstanding is the measure of number of days it takes you from incurring a cost of goods, so you bought raw materials or packaging, how long then it takes to pay the supplier. And so you want that number to be as long as possible. You want to hold onto your cash for as long as possible. And so this is the number of days it takes to pay vendors. Now, when we look at the DPO, or Days Payable Outstanding, the formula for that is going to be taking accounts payable and dividing it by your cost of goods. And so you take that and you multiply it by the number of days in the period. Let's go through an example. So if we are saying that for Gut Buddy for May of 2020, our accounts payable is $3 million and our cost of goods sold is 1.2 million, multiplied by the number of days in May, 31 days, we'll get 78 days. So this is saying that it takes us 78 days to pay the supplier. It's not a bad number. The industry average is about 90 days. So you want to try to get a little bit closer to 90 by negotiating with suppliers to have your payment terms get closer to 90. So obviously the insight we get from that is that if the industry average is 90 days to pay suppliers and it's taking us 78 days, it means that we can push a little bit more and get to 90 days. And you know, the way to do that is to negotiate good payment terms with the vendors. Are we doing enough of that? So that's the question you got to ask yourself when you see this number. So it's important for you to measure every single month and see where you're at. Are you improving that number? Are you getting from 78 and you're getting closer to 85 or to 90? And the second thing to look at is whether we are paying at the end of the term of the payment. And so one of the things I've seen at companies is that in many cases, the right hand doesn't know what the left hand is doing. So you are coming up with all these strategies to try and improve your days payable outstanding, but you're not communicating to your accounts payable department. You want to be able to tell them and instruct them to pay toward the end of the window for payment. So if the supplier is allowing you 75 days to pay them, you got to make sure to instruct your accounts payable staff to pay at the very end of that window, not in the middle, not at 75% of it, but like at the end toward just like the last day. And now that we talked about the KPIs for the income statement and for the balance sheet, we're able to create a scorecard. And a scorecard is a report that you present to management at month end and show them the progress we're making. So you can present them with the KPIs we covered, revenue growth year over year, same store sales year over year, gross margin, and then gross margin per SKU, and then the balance sheet KPIs, which is the days sales outstanding and days payable outstanding. So basically what you do is you layer in the actual for these KPIs so that visually right there you can see where you stand with all of these KPIs. And then what you do is you layer in targets. And setting targets comes from knowing where you want to go with the business. And so if your target for the business is to achieve a 28% gross margin, this becomes your target. Also, targets come by looking at historical data and understanding where the business has been and what trajectory it should take in order for it to reach higher profitability. And now that you've shown the target and the actual, you can show the delta between actual and target. And so now visually, you can tell very quickly the state of the business by looking at the scorecard.